Hi everyone, my name is John Baumgart, and today I'm going to discuss J. Edgar Hoover. My thoughts on J. Edgar Hoover. And the basis for this is this book, The Life of J. Edgar Hoover, Secrecy and Power. The book is a bit dated, and I will discuss that shortly because it does play a role in how the book portrayed him. However, it was a good book. One thing I'll note before I jump too far is this is a hobby for me, my channel, so I just don't have time to edit things. Maybe later on I will if I do more videos. So I basically just do this video off the cuff. I sometimes will stop and redo the whole thing, so the uploaded version is better, but I'm just speaking and I try to nail down most of the points. Sometimes I don't get everything, but I'm just too busy with other things. This is my hobby. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about J. Edgar Hoover. Personally, I didn't know much about him prior to reading this book. I mean, obviously I knew the name, but only by name. I know there's a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. I never watched it, so I came into learning about him very much unbiased and clean slate. And so if you're interested in hearing my thoughts, I'm not giving you a bio of his life or anything like that. So if you're trying to use this for a school paper, I don't think it would be helpful. However, I'm giving you my analysis of what I learned in the book and his whole life. Maybe you could use me as a reference or what I'm discussing to build a thesis paper. Or if you're just interested in who this guy was and you don't want to read the long book that I did. So here are my thoughts on Hoover, just some major points about his life and his career. The number one thing about his life was self-preservation. That was number one. This is what drove him. And I think it's important in our political context because, we have to apply this to modern day times. The government is growing and growing in America. The spending in America is out of control, in my opinion. This is something true conservatives, not even the ones we have in power now because they're passing these crazy spending bills, but true conservatives or Republicans are against. And libertarians. And how this relates to Hoover is it's a bit dangerous when you have someone in power for so long and their number one intention or motivation is to just make sure they stay in power. He was actually a very, very moral person and did stick to his principles, but he was always looking to preserve himself. And you have to imagine, anyone in civil service or government, that's their career, that's their job. You may complain about your job. You may say it sucks. But once you lose it, maybe it's not so bad. So I think we can all relate to this. But a takeaway is there has to be some type of limitation set that can't be abused, which I'll get into. A major way he stayed in power, and this is the bad part, is he had dirt on a lot of people, on reporters, on politicians, and obviously he compromises morals to get this information, and that dirt only grew. And this book didn't touch upon it. There are more conspiracy theories and other things about what happened after he died. Obviously, he didn't plan things as he probably would have liked to. A lot of things he did have shredded, but there were things uncovered. I don't know enough about it. I don't think it's important to understand his life. That's more his post-life, which is not the subject of this video. But it's important to know the main reason he was able to stay in power so long was because he had dirt on everyone. Detractors were badmouthed, and you have to understand this is pre-social media. The major media at the time were newspapers and only late in his career television. So it was much easier to control the press than it is now, or information. And I think that's better overall. So the second thing about Hoover that's interesting is he had a strong personal moral code and then a code within the FBI. And he would always allow the FBI code to supersede his moral code. So what do I mean about that? I'm going to touch upon this in a little bit, but in our 2020 lens, we would view Hoover as a racist. But in the time, he was a product of his environment, and we'll put that aside for now. But he definitely wanted to make sure or see that in his FBI, only white men were in power. And that's who, under his FBI, most of the employees were, and most of his agents were. However, if the KKK tried to challenge the authority of the US government, he would stop them. As much as in private he might agree with a lot of their beliefs. So that's an example. And he even would come to the defense of Martin Luther King, who he disliked so much, if the public was on their side. Something else that was interesting about his life. So he always would allow the preservation of the government or the government's authority, like Eric Cartman, over his own moral beliefs. And so often these two had to fight with each other, and preserving the government's role would always come first. So, to get into this, let's talk about race and his approach. So what I was saying before is, in our 2020 lens, and this is something that drives me nuts about modern day times, is we take every historical figure, everything that ever happened, and apply it to our morals. You have to understand, not until 20 years ago did we have things like veganism, did we have the same level of acceptance of homosexuality, which is something I'll talk about race related. We've made incredible progress in a short period of time. You have to understand, this guy is a product of his environment. So, like I mentioned, in his FBI, he did not keep minorities until he was pressured in the 60s to do so. And he grew up in a time where whites felt that, they were racially superior to blacks. So the only agents he had during his time were kind of his servants. It was almost borderline slavery, because he had one agent that would drive him around. He had to work 6 days a week. He would curate his lawn. It was crazy. And that guy was considered an agent. Obviously, he did no work. He was kind of making himself like a mini plantation owner in a sense. And it's important to understand why. And this is why it drives me nuts when people try to do this historical revisionism. You have to understand. And so I liken J. Edgar Hoover to Germany. So I'm going to go on a little tangent, but I think it's important. So, I know a lot about German history. I can speak German fluently. I've lived there. And if you want to understand very quickly in 2 minutes, why did Germany start 2 world wars? Look at Germany's history, okay? If you look at Germany's history, it only united in the late 1800s, so late 19th century. Prior to that, it was always a footnote in historical stories. So one prince from Habsburg or one queen married into the Spanish family or the French family. I'm just making broad statements, but Germany never played a major role. It was a lot of different kind of nation states, or it's called the Holy Roman Empire. It never had its own united front. So around the time of the 19th century, when this idea of nation state started to come into presence, Germany felt inferior to the kingdoms of France, of Spain, of England especially, who had these long traditions of kingdomhood, which Germany did not participate in. However, Germany felt, as a nation, superior to the Slavs of the East, to the Poles, to the Russians, to all these other groups. So this created a strange dynamic of a kind of an inferiority complex, you could say. And so applying this to Hoover, he felt the same way. He didn't come from money. He didn't come from an aristocratic background. He was just a middle-class person. And so when the challenges of racial equality came up in the 60s, he didn't like this. And this is kind of going into my last theme of irrelevance, is that he kind of stayed in the FBI longer than he needed to. So a lot of what he did in his career basically came up against his own, number 2 moral beliefs, and he didn't really help out the cause very much. And why was this? Because he grew up in a time and period, like I said, where whites generally felt that they were superior to blacks, mostly blacks, other minorities. And because he wasn't rich, because he didn't come from this stock, the only way that he could make himself feel better was by preserving that. If suddenly blacks could get the same level of status as whites, where would he be? Maybe he wouldn't be as successful. So he didn't like this. This is what formed his character way, way, way in the very early 1900s. So you can't expect that when this guy is 60 years old, that he's going to change his mind. So he disliked Martin Luther King. That was his number 1 enemy. He could not stand him. He didn't like that a black man was trying to challenge everything that he believed in. So he went out of his way, unsuccessfully, to try to, delegitimize him, to call him a communist. He failed. Ultimately, he was a failure in this. So, and that shows kind of his peak. That I would say around the time of Martin Luther King is when he was irrelevant. He actually, was planting microphones in his hotel rooms. And I would say this was another thing that he didn't like is, Martin Luther King, and I talk about this as well, he was not perfect. He definitely had affairs with other women. Hoover had recordings of this, and he mailed tapes even to Martin Luther King to try to get him to stop. I mean, he didn't like the fact that he was a preacher, because Hoover was a religious man. He didn't like the fact that Martin Luther King he called him a phony in the sense that, he compromised his morals. But I would say that was just an excuse to dislike him. Hoover did not like the fact that this was going on. He was not really a huge fan of civil rights, but when he realized that the public was in favor of it, he begrudgingly had to defend times when, laws, when laws were passed. Basically, then Hoover had to say, well, I have to defend these laws, and I have to send the FBI. One side note about him is before we had the 1950s communism, it was an issue in America around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and a little before, in the beginning of the 1900s. And, Hoover definitely interpreted the law very loosely to expel communists in America, to disrupt their groups. FBI agents raided offices. They did a lot of things they shouldn't. They put a lot of people in temporary jail. And this later became, exposed. And he nearly lost his job. Luckily, he was able to preserve himself. But he learned a very important lesson, that he could only have the public on his side when he did something. So, the recent movie Irishman talks a lot about the mob. And for a long time, the FBI stayed away from the mob because Hoover didn't feel that the public was on his side enough to go after the mob. And he would always deflect and say, no, we need to let the local police, local governments deal with this, until finally, from pressure from the Kennedys, he changed his tune. But it's kind of an example where the same thing with civil rights. Only until most of the country approved of civil rights did he finally go on board. Because once again, self-preservation. He didn't want to go out on a limb, let's say go after the mob when it wasn't all over the press. And if for some reason it didn't get enough national attention or wasn't popular, he's afraid he would lose his job, as he almost did in his initial communist purges, which would be something very interesting to research. It's something I knew very little about. So I would say, getting back to Irrelevance, this is the final part of, Hoover's, just the general idea that someone can't be a director of the FBI for so long, especially nowadays where morals and rules change. Basically his peak was fighting communism in the 50s. I think he was effective at this. We didn't really get the infiltration that everyone expected. I think, because of the FBI's work, they were just too scared, communist groups, to do anything. So afterwards, when a lot of the civil rights protests came about, riots in the 60s, a lot of student protests, he was out of touch at this time. He just was not the same person. He didn't like hippies, he didn't like students, and he stuck to his guns. I mean, you have to understand, in the FBI he ran, he had a dress code for people. He, was very much a control freak if they were drinking too much, and he was out of touch with the times. So when the 60s came around, that was his peak, essentially, because he couldn't understand what was going on. He disagreed with it. He basically was not getting the support of the public that he used to. And he sounded like an out-of-touch old man when he spoke up against this. So, that's a case to be made where I don't think anyone should be in power that long, because they become out of touch, and their moral code and their way of living is he was basically applying a 1920s standard in the 1960s, some 40 years later, and it didn't work. And so he fell out of touch, and I think it was probably for his own legacy better that he died when he did, or maybe even if he died sooner. He was supposed to retire, and this is what I'm saying in the beginning about government, but he was good friends with Eisenhower. It was probably one of the best relations he had with the president. So it was either Eisenhower or Johnson, but both of them he was good friends with, and one of them just extended his tenure, and that's garbage. I mean, you can't. What's the point of it? If a president likes you and can just extend your tenure, then why have that law? So that was a big problem I found with keeping a director for so long. They should have term limits because he became irrelevant. So I saved the kind of the juiciest part for last, which is was Hoover a homosexual? Was he a cross-dresser? This book that I picked was written in, I think, the 1989, so it didn't talk anything about that. I don't like too much sensational things anyway. If you want my analysis, I would say that I think he was a homosexual, but once again, for a man who was from the 1920s, I think he was very embarrassed about this. It's something you have to understand that at the time that he was raised, the best modern day example we can give is maybe pedophilia. If you can imagine the moral judgment. So in the 20s, 30s, if you're a homosexual, you were viewed in the same lens as we would view a pedophile today. So I think he was very embarrassed about this. Nothing in the book or nothing I've read shows any real interaction with women, he never married, never fathered any children. And he had Clyde Tolson as his number two, who was a man he would basically spend all of his time with. He would go to breakfast every day with this guy, and he had a very strict routine, kind of like an obsessive Howard Hughes routine, where every morning he would wake up, he would eat the same thing, he would do the same thing, he would vacation every year in the same place with the same person, So he was a bit neurotic in this sense, but he spent all of his time with Clyde Tolson. He was basically his only confidant and friend, and for both of these men to just live with each other for 30 years, or to just be buddies or pals, come on. But in their time period, I think that was the only way that they could kind of maintain a homosexual relationship. So in my opinion, I think he was, but he was embarrassed about this, and so I think that's why he had to have this, it was strange. And I think the best example, I'm going to read a part of this from the book, is when a Nixon associate visited his office. And it touches upon a couple of things. First, his irrelevance, and what I think is his homosexuality. So in the book, seen through Ehrlichman's eyes, Hoover's efforts to please his guests were ridiculous, even pitiful. Hoover greeted them at the door. Drinks were served by a black, tall agent. Notice, he had a black guy serving them the drinks. It's like, you couldn't do that. It's crazy. Even then it was out of touch. The living room, a hall of memories, seemed dingy, almost seedy. Hoover's neighbors were in awe of the hundreds of pictures of him. So you can see he has all these pictures. What he noticed is how old they were. Most of them had been there for years and were brown and faded. He condescendingly noted that some of them showed Hoover with old-time movie actresses, whose names I couldn't recall. He estimated there 400 or 500 pictures. So imagine, this guy is just out of touch. He has all these pictures of celebrities from the 20s and 30s or whenever that no one knows anymore. This was at the time that this guy came to his house. It was in the late 60s, early 70s. When the president was settled, Hoover's longtime friend and housemate, Clyde Tolson, looking pale, came down the narrow stairs and shambled. So he was living with Hoover at the time. Come on, it's obvious that they were a gay couple. It says, despite the innuendo here, Tolson was not living with Hoover. He'd just gotten out of the hospital, and Hoover put him up for about 4 weeks. Once again, the book is saying this, but, to me it sounds like a convenient excuse. What's very interesting is then they describe, Hoover. Here we go. Here's the most important part where I think it's proof more or less that he was a homosexual. Ehrlichman found more to ridicule in the narrowest of stairs, in the recreation room. Near the door was a bar, and wall behind it was papered with the coy sort of nude pinups one saw in the old Esquire, meaning like these very classic pinups of women. Even the lampshade was covered with nudes. The effect of this display was to engender disbelief. It seemed totally contrived. That impression was reinforced when Hoover deliberately called our attention to his naughty gallery, as if it were something he wanted us to know about J. Edgar Hoover. So he's overcompensating, you know. He's trying to say, hey, look here. Look at all these pinups of girls. Who does that? You know, so to me, I think you can read between the lines. I mean, remember, this is someone else's account, someone who didn't like him, but I would take, even if he's embellishing, I would take some grain of salt. Or I would say there's a grain of truth in that. So that's, you know, my basic thoughts. And what's my own opinion of Hoover? I think for his time, he was an effective leader. I think what he'll be known for is his battles against communism. You know, it never really infiltrated America. There was never a strong communist party in America. You know, if you were to look back in history, that was his greatest success. But, you know, I think his reputation now will be tarnished because of what's been leaked about him, or, you know, the dirt he had on people. I mean, they still have the building named after him. You know, my own view is I think I go back to the Irrelevance, that he just wanted to hold on to power so long. He didn't realize that it was actually bad for the country when he should retire. I didn't talk about Nixon too much, but he was smart enough to avoid a lot of the wiretap requests and other espionage activities, even before Watergate, that Nixon's men wanted him to engage him. So, I mean, these guys were, his men were very shady, you know, to use our modern terms. So, you know, I think, you know, the last point I'll make is, like anything else, I bristle against how we are always doing this revisionism. So now, you know, I mentioned this book was older. If this book was written today, it would say what a racist he is, what a horrible person he was. You have to realize he is a product of his times. Okay, I can't emphasize that enough. So it drives me nuts. So my final thoughts on him were, you know, like what the book mentioned, and I'll read the last paragraph, which I think is kind of summarizes what I was saying about irrelevance. A political system, a nation, cannot survive unless those who are frightened and endangered by change feel that their interests are being represented and protected. The government must adapt to shifting circumstances, but at the same time, it must stand as bulwark against disorder and a pillar of stability and continuity. For much of the century, for millions of Americans, J. Edgar Hoover was that bulwark and pillar. As long as they saw Hoover standing guard, they could believe the familiar community ruled by age-old traditions, the America they could recognize as a country they knew and loved and still endured. But he himself endured too long. It was tragedy of the man and of the nation that in the end, Hoover's great qualities of leadership and his unrivaled organizational abilities no longer served the vital needs of the nation. They were devoted instead to protecting Hoover's own interests and those of his FBI. Hoover ended his life embittered and isolated, his bureau a monument to his past and to his memories of an America that hardly existed outside its walls. So thanks for listening. If you like this, I'll make more of these on my own random thoughts. So make sure to subscribe and talk to you soon.